Not every presence illuminates. Some extinguish your light. Have you ever felt this? That silent sensation of being close to someone but slowly disappearing inside? It's as if your soul begins to shrink, as if every word spoken costs a piece of who you are. You try to understand what's happening, but there's no logical explanation. Just a weariness that starts inside your chest and spreads, taking over everything. There are presences that don't scream but suffocate, that don't hurt you with words but with their absence. And the strangest thing is that you feel it. Even without wanting to admit it, your body perceives it. Your heart perceives it. Your energy changes. The glow that once existed begins to fade, and your essence begins to hide behind a practiced smile. Rumi said, "Love shouldn't shrink you, it should expand you." But what happens when love, or what you call love, begins to erase you? Have you ever looked in the mirror and no longer recognized yourself? Have you ever felt that when you were with someone, your silence stopped being peaceful and turned to fear? There's something sacred in realizing when your light begins to fade, because that's when your spirit cries out for help. It asks to be seen, heard, remembered. It asks to come home, because there are people who arrive with promises of warmth, but bring cold disguised as affection. And you, in your eagerness to be loved, begin to adapt to the cold. At first, it feels like love. It feels like care. It feels like destiny. But over time, the soul senses, what should heal is sickening. Your presence becomes smaller, quieter, almost invisible. And yet, you remain, for fear of loss, for hope of change, for believing that love is endurance. But love has never been about fading so that the other person can shine. Love has never been about losing your own shine to sustain someone else's reflection. It's easy to pretend everything's fine. It's easy to justify it. She's just tired. It's her way. It'll pass. But the body doesn't lie. The soul doesn't lie. When someone's presence begins to drain you, life loses color. You start talking less, dreaming less, even breathing differently. It's as if your spiritual frequency is being subtly altered, molded to the rhythm of the one who's erasing you. And before you know it, silence is no longer your refuge. It's your prison. Her presence is in everything. In your thoughts, in your fears, in your renunciations. And little by little you cease to exist in the small details. The laughter that was once light becomes restrained. The gaze that shone begins to fade. The touch that once warmed now weighs heavily. You feel the weight of being someone you can no longer be. And the worst part is that, even realizing it, you still try to convince yourself it's love. But Rumi said, if someone's presence erases you, it's because it didn't come from the light. There are bonds born of the soul and others that come from the ego disguised as love. One binds, the other liberates. One demands you prove yourself, the other recognizes you in silence. And perhaps this is the point where you begin to awaken. The moment you realize that loving isn't disappearing, it's blossoming. You know, there's a specific pain in being with someone and feeling like you're losing yourself. It's a pain that makes no noise, but eats away at you from within. You start to cut yourself back, to diminish yourself, to walk more lightly so as not to disturb them. But the more you shrink, the further away you become from who you truly are. And the soul can't bear to live disguised for long. It screams, even if silently. This is the pain of those who feel when someone's presence extinguishes their own fire. A silent but profound pain. A sadness that doesn't come from outside, but from self-forgetfulness. Because at some point, you began to believe that love was a sacrifice. That to be loved, you had to mold yourself. That to be seen, you had to dim your shine. But the truth is different. The love that comes from the soul never asks you to extinguish yourself. It ignites you. It gives you back. And maybe that's why you're here now, hearing these words, seeking to understand something your heart already knows, but your mind still denies. Because deep down you feel, there's something wrong with loving and feeling like you're fading away. There's something wrong with being close and feeling distant. There's something wrong with calling love what overshadows you. So, breathe, be silent, and observe, because it is in silence that the soul reveals what the heart pretends not to see. And maybe, just maybe, what you're feeling right now isn't the end of a love. It's the beginning of your return to your own light. If these words resonated with you, take a deep breath and observe what they awakened within you. Maybe it's just a reminder, or maybe it's the sign your soul has been waiting for to hear itself again. Because understanding what's extinguishing you is the first step to rekindling what's yours. When you recognize that there are presences draining your energy, something changes. You begin to perceive who lifts you up and who weakens you. You begin to listen to your body, your intuition, the silence that once hurt and now begins to speak. And it is in that instant that awareness becomes healing. Because the soul only shines again when you accept seeing what was hidden behind blind love, emotional dependence, the need to be seen. So, if something in this video spoke directly to how you feel, write it here in the comments. I choose my light. These 4 words are more than a comment. They're a commitment to yourself, a way of saying to your soul, I heard you. And if this content helped you understand a little more about the presences that extinguish and those that awaken, leave a like. It's the simplest way to get this message across to those who are also losing themselves in silence. Subscribe to the channel, because this journey isn't about a video. It's about remembering every day that your light is sacred and shouldn't be given to those who don't know its value. Stay tuned, because in the next video, I'll show you what happens when you finally decide to walk away from everything that's draining your soul and start living in peace with your own presence. There's an almost imperceptible moment when the soul begins to shrink. No one sees, no one comments, but you feel it. You feel it when your presence is no longer noticed, when your gaze is no longer sought, when what you say seems to no longer resonate. It's subtle, but devastating. It's the kind of pain that comes not from a word, but from an absence. The absence of being felt, of being seen, of being recognized. And it's there, in that invisible silence, that the process of disappearing begins. Little by little, your energy is drained, as if each encounter with that person costs a little more life. You try to understand what's happening, but you find no explanation. Because nothing is said, nothing is done in an obvious way. It's just a change in tone, a lack of sparkle in the eyes, a gesture that once existed and now has disappeared. The soul perceives before the mind. It whispers that something isn't right. And yet, you persist, believing it's just a phase, that everything will go back to the way it was. But it doesn't, because something deep has been broken. The exchange. When love becomes a shadow, it's no longer love. It's dependence. You feel the weight of this presence. It's like walking with the sun overhead and still feeling cold. The energy around you shifts. The once light atmosphere becomes dense, and the silence between you begins to weigh more heavily than any words. You realize you're adapting to it. You're lowering your voice, changing your demeanor, trying to be pleasant enough not to disturb. And this is the beginning of emotional death. When you cease to be whole to fit into the space of someone who has never seen you fully. There's something almost spiritual about this kind of disconnection. Rumi said that the soul recognizes when it's far from home. And that's exactly what happens when you're with someone who erases you. Your soul begins to miss itself. It's a void that can't be filled with physical presence because what's missing isn't company. It's connection. You're with someone, and yet you feel alone. And this loneliness is the cruelest of all, because it's a loneliness accompanied. Over time, your body begins to react. You feel the heaviness upon waking, the exhaustion that can't be explained. The brightness in your eyes becomes dull, and your voice loses its strength. It's not physical fatigue. It's the energetic drain of remaining where your soul doesn't breathe. The presence that once seemed necessary now becomes suffocating, and you realize that the love that brought you there no longer exists, or perhaps never existed in the way you believed. It was merely the reflection of a lack, the echo of an old fear of being abandoned. But there's a part of you that still tries to resist, that believes that if you love more, talk less, give in a little more, maybe everything will be lighter again. It's this part that suffers the most because it doesn't understand that the problem isn't a lack of effort, but a lack of reciprocity. Love doesn't last when only one side shines. Love isn't staying where your presence is invisible. And yet, the heart insists, out of habit, out of hope, out of fear of accepting what's already obvious. You begin to feel increasingly dim. The things that once brought you joy no longer attract you. What once brought you joy now seems distant. And the most painful thing is realizing that you've ceased to exist, becoming an extension of someone else's life. It's as if your light has been placed at the service of another, and you're no longer allowed to light it yourself. And this, Rumi would say, is the beginning of spiritual death. the moment when a being disconnects from their own divine spark. The feeling of disappearing isn't just emotional, it's energetic. You feel the atmosphere closing in, the air seeming heavier, time passing more slowly. It's as if your soul is trying to warn you that you're becoming too small to fit into this relationship. But you try to silence that voice, and the more you silence it, the more distant you become from yourself. Its presence drains you, and what's left is a void disguised as coexistence. And it's at this point that the hardest truth to accept emerges. Not all presence is light. Some presences are lessons. Some appear only to show how much you still abandon yourself in the name of a love that never truly existed. And when you begin to realize this, something within you awakens. It's a painful but liberating awakening. You begin to understand that choosing your peace isn't selfish, it's spiritual wisdom. So before you keep trying to rekindle what's already gone, ask yourself, who have I become alongside this presence? This question, if asked courageously, can give you back everything you've lost. If this part of the video touched you at any point, if you recognized yourself in these words, write here in the comments. I felt when my soul fell silent. Rumi said, don't lose yourself in those who mistake you for their own emptiness. And this is perhaps one of the hardest truths to accept. Because when you deeply admire someone, when you believe that their presence is light, you begin to mold yourself to fit into their space. It's subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it's there that the dissolution of your essence begins. You cease to be whole and become a mirror. You begin to measure your worth through the eyes of others. And without realizing it, you begin to distance yourself from yourself. There's a huge difference between sharing your light and giving it away. When you share, it multiplies. When you give it away, it dims. And that's what happens when admiration turns into submission. You start seeking approval in every gesture, every word, every silence. You start living to avoid disappointing, to be what others expect. And this erodes what is most pure within you, the authenticity of your soul. The energy changes completely. You no longer speak with the same force. Your opinions become timid. Your gaze, once firm, begins to ask for permission to exist. It's an invisible but devastating process. The other person's presence becomes the center, and you begin to orbit around it, believing that this is what love is, revolving around someone until you lose your bearings. But it isn't. Love that comes from the soul doesn't ask you to disappear. It expands you. It doesn't demand self-denial. It calls you into your own truth. And it's strange to realize how silent this loss is. You don't realize it at the exact moment it begins to happen. You only realize it when the mirror no longer reflects what you once were, when your words are filled with fear, when your presence no longer fills the space as it once did. And the worst part is that, by seeking acceptance so much, you begin to believe that this erased version is who you truly are. But Rumi reminded us that true love is the encounter of two free souls, not two prisons that feed on each other's absence. When your light depends on the other's presence, you're not loving. You're begging for recognition. And the soul senses this. It senses when the glow becomes artificial, when the connection becomes a contract, when love becomes a cracked mirror. You begin to notice the signs. Your energy contracts around this person. Your body tenses. Your breathing changes. Everything that was natural becomes heavy. You walk on tiptoe so as not to be misunderstood. You measure your words, you silence your desires. And every time you remain silent so as not to lose someone, you lose a little more of yourself. It's a kind of death that happens silently, without witnesses. The death of someone who can no longer hear themselves. There's something deeply spiritual about this kind of emotional imprisonment, because when your essence is extinguished, the entire universe seems to grow darker. It's as if God whispers within you, I gave you light not to hide it. But you persist, believing you're being faithful to love, when in fact you're being unfaithful to your soul. Love doesn't ask you to be small. Divine love invites you to be whole. And the more you lose yourself, the more you feel you need the other to exist. This dependence is the soul's most dangerous veil, because it convinces you that you are not enough without that presence. And that's how you surrender, not by choice but by fear. Fear of being alone, fear of not being loved, fear of facing your own emptiness. But emptiness has never been the enemy. Emptiness is the space where your light is reborn when you have the courage to look at yourself anew. There's a deep pain in realizing you've given your light away to someone who never knew what to do with it. And yet there's beauty in this awakening. Because the moment you recognize you've been extinguished is the same moment your flame begins to reignite. You begin to understand that true presence doesn't consume you. It inspires you. That true love doesn't demand sacrifice of essence. It celebrates your existence. But until you reach this clarity, there's a path of shadows. A path where you lose yourself to learn to find yourself again. Where you surrender to discover the limits of your own soul. And it's in this silent territory between what you were and what you haven't yet become that learning happens. The learning to no longer confuse love with dependence, admiration with submission, presence with possession. Perhaps what hurts most isn't what the other person did, but how much you allowed yourself to be erased trying to be enough. How much you stopped being who you were to fit the mold of someone who only saw the surface. But there's no blame in that. There's just the human reflection of someone who loves without knowing themselves, of someone who seeks in the other what was always inside. And if you got this far, and felt this message cross your chest, recognized yourself at that point, where love became a mirror and the reflection confused you, right in the comments. I exist beyond presence. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. A silent, deep fatigue that grows within you until the simple act of existing becomes a burdensome task. It's the fatigue of constantly molding yourself, trying to fit into spaces that no longer accommodate who you've become. It's that exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest because it's not physical. It's energetic, spiritual. It's the body of the soul asking to come home, to a space where it can breathe again without needing to ask permission to exist. You feel it when you wake up, and before you even begin your day, you're already carrying a weight you can't name. When being near someone should be light, but their presence becomes a silent battle, a field of tension where your spirit shrinks to maintain peace. It's the invisible fatigue of someone who constantly edits themselves, measures their words, calculates their gestures, fearing that their own authenticity is too much. It's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't scream, it whispers. But the body hears, the heart understands. Silence becomes the only space where you still recognize yourself. This fatigue comes from the constant repetition of something unnatural. It's the wear and tear of having to constantly adjust, of feeling that your behavior is annoying, that your intensity is misinterpreted, that your love is always too exaggerated. You begin to restrict yourself, to contain what you feel, to disguise what you think, and each time you do, your soul distances itself further from what is true. You're not tired because you live too long, but because you live wrong. You live trapped in a bond that requires effort to sustain. The energy drained by the wrong kind of relationship is one of the slowest ways to die internally. You feel like the environment drains you, that conversations empty you, that time spent with certain people takes more from you than it gives back. And the cruelest thing is that, at first you don't realize it. You think it's just a phase, that it's stress, that it's a lack of time. But deep down you know better. You know your spirit is being drained by a connection that has stopped nourishing and started consuming. Rumi said that where love is true, there is growth, and where there is weariness, there is illusion. And that's exactly it. Invisible fatigue arises when love stops being an exchange and becomes resistance. When the bond, instead of nourishing your soul, begins to drain it. When the presence that should bring you peace becomes a constant reminder that you need to diminish yourself to move forward. And the body, wisely, begins to react. The mind loses focus, the chest tightens, sleep no longer restores, laughter no longer comes, because the weary soul finds no rest where there is imbalance. There are days when you feel like disappearing, not because you want to escape, but because you want rest. Rest from feeling so much, from trying so hard, from explaining yourself so much. This is the emotional weight of carrying what isn't yours. The guilt, the silence, the expectations of others. You carry the other person on your shoulders without realizing it, believing you're saving the relationship, when in reality, you're losing yourself within it. The love that requires constant effort to exist stopped being love a long time ago. It's a kind of pain that goes beyond the emotional. It's spiritual, because when your energy is drained, you disconnect from your own light, and the more you try to hold on, the weaker you feel. Have you noticed this? The more you try to fix what can't be fixed, the more distant you become from yourself. This happens because there are places that demand your presence but can't support your essence. And every time you try to fit in, Your soul shrinks a little more. But there comes a time when the body can't take it anymore. The heart starts to give signals, emotions become confused, and silence becomes an inevitable refuge. It's at this point that you realize it's not laziness nor passing sadness. It's the soul crying out for freedom. It wants to return home. It wants to remember what is light, what is true, what is yours. Invisible fatigue is the universe's way of warning you that you're living far from your own frequency. And when you understand this, something inside you changes. You begin to realize that it's not weakness to walk away from what weighs you down. It's spiritual self-care. That choosing silence isn't cold. It's energetic wisdom. Because true love, the love that comes from the soul, doesn't require effort. It flows. It doesn't exhaust you. It expands you. It doesn't demand anything. It embraces you. It doesn't drain you. It recharges you. But before reaching this understanding, there's a process. The process of emptying yourself of the wrong presences, of the connections that confuse you, of the relationships that keep you constantly on alert. This emptying is painful but necessary, because your soul needs space to breathe again, and as long as it's busy bearing the weight of a tired love, there will be no room for peace to enter. If this part of the video spoke to something you feel, if you recognize this invisible fatigue that is slowly erasing you, write in the comments, "I feel the weight of what erases me." There comes a time when love stops being love and becomes an illusion. It still feels like love on the surface, still brings beautiful words, still cloaked in care and promise, but deep down, it's lifeless. It's a distorted love, the kind that makes you believe you need to diminish yourself to be loved, that teaches you, without saying anything, that being yourself is too much, that feeling deeply is an exaggeration, that expressing what hurts is drama. And it is thus, little by little, that you begin to adjust, to shrink, to erase the colors of your soul to fit into a space that was never yours. Rumi warned, "True love doesn't ask you to disappear. It makes you blossom." But when you're caught up in this illusion, you don't realize how much you've been slowly disappearing. Because the distortion comes masked as affection, covered in phrases like, "I only want the best for you," or "You're too sensitive," and you, with an open heart, believe it. You believe that love is endurance, that love is synonymous with adaptation, that giving in is proof of maturity. But there's a fine line between adapting and losing yourself, and when that line is crossed, love stops healing and begins to hurt. You begin to live under the false belief that if you do everything right, you'll finally be loved, that if you're calmer, more understanding, more gentle, the other person will realize how much you deserve to be there. And in this attempt, you move away from what's natural within you, your intensity, your sensitivity, your truth. The love that should liberate begins to imprison, and this is one of the soul's most silent pains, realizing that what you call love is slowly suffocating you. The cruelest thing about this illusion is that it feeds on fear, the fear of rejection, the fear of being alone, the fear of losing what gives you a false sense of belonging. And this fear creates a spiritual distortion, because love becomes a field of survival, not expansion. You stop loving freely and start begging for affection. You stop flourishing and start hiding. The soul, born to express itself, learns to silence itself. Rumi said that love is the fire that purifies, not the shadow that consumes. Love that extinguishes is not love. It's need disguised as feeling. It's the mind trying to call destiny what is merely attachment. You begin to believe that this relationship is necessary, that this person is essential, but in reality, it's just your wound trying to stay alive. And as you feed this dynamic, your spirit wears thin. It's as if your light is being used to illuminate the emptiness of someone who never intended to see you. That's why illusory love is so dangerous. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It slowly erodes until you no longer realize who you are. You get used to the discomfort, adapt to the silence, convince yourself that the absence of pain is the same as peace. But what you call peace is often anesthesia. It's the soul ceasing to react out of exhaustion. And it's at this point that love stops being an exchange and becomes emotional survival. When you're in this kind of love, everything revolves around approval. Every gesture is an attempt to be seen, every word an attempt to be accepted. You measure the tone of your voice, calculate what you can and can't say, and your heart becomes dependent on the small crumbs of attention the other offers. This isn't love. It's dependence in disguise. It's the ego trying to fill the void of rejection with presences that only echo the lack. But there's a part of the soul that's never wrong. Even in the most twisted relationships, it keeps whispering softly, "This isn't love." And that whisper repeats itself until you have the courage to hear it. The courage to look in the mirror and recognize that what you feel isn't fulfillment. It's fear of losing what little they give you. True love doesn't demand that you disappear. It invites you to blossom alongside the other. It doesn't extinguish you. It ignites you. It doesn't limit you. It expands you. Have you ever noticed how your soul shrinks when you experience something that isn't true? Your breath becomes shallow. Your gaze dulls. Your smile becomes automatic. And yet, you persist, because your heart wants to believe that love can change another. But love wasn't meant to change anyone. It was meant to liberate. True love doesn't make you feel small. It restores your greatness. It reminds you that what is true never requires you to betray yourself to be accepted. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson. Realizing that the love that erases you was never love. It was attachment. That the love that demands silence was never love. It was fear. And the love that drains you was never love. It was illusion. The soul knows this. It feels the difference between the love that uplifts and the love that drains. Between the love that heals and the love that sickens. And when it realizes this, it begins to move, albeit silently. Because real love, the kind that comes from the soul, requires no effort. It's light, natural, and free. It brings you closer to God, not to fear. And perhaps all this love you call love is just a reminder of what's true. And true love always makes you blossom. If you felt these words touch something inside you, if you realized that perhaps you confused love with need, write in the comments, "I choose the love that makes me blossom." Notice, when you fall silent, your soul reveals who is erasing you. There's an invisible force in silence that the ego can't stand. Because silence doesn't disguise, it reveals. It exposes what the noise of dysfunctional love tries to hide. At first, when everything still seems beautiful, the noise of words, promises, and intense gestures masks the truth. But as soon as silence arrives, the masks begin to fall. What was once enchantment turns into suffocation, and what seemed like love reveals control. It's in silence that you realize who truly sees you and who only fed off your energy. Silence doesn't lie. It's the soul's most faithful mirror. When you stop explaining, justifying, insisting, what's true remains. What's illusion dissolves. And it's in this space of stillness that truth reveals itself with an almost painful clarity. Because in silence, the presence that once seemed essential begins to show how much it weighed. And you realize that much of what you called love was just emotional noise, a desperate attempt to stay connected to someone who was no longer there. Rumi said that silence is the language of God, and when you finally fall silent, the divine begins to speak. But God's voice doesn't come as comfort, it comes as truth. It shows what the heart didn't want to see. It shows how much you've lost yourself trying to keep alive a flame that no longer burned out of reciprocity, but out of habit. It's at this moment that the soul whispers, "It's not a lack of love, it's an excess of noise." And that's when the most difficult process begins, that of listening to yourself after so much time explaining yourself. You realize how much silence bothers those who thrive on your dedication. Because those who feed on your energy need your noise, your movement, your insistence. Your silence is a threat because it's the beginning of your return. It breaks the cycle of dependence. It takes away the power of those who only remain strong through your constant presence. That's why when you're silent, others get angry, accuse you of coldness, call you distant. But it's not distance, it's healing. It's the space where your soul finally breathes without needing to ask permission. Silence reveals imbalance. It shows who has always given more and who has always fed off what was given. It shows the difference between love and attachment, between surrender and draining. In noise, everything seems intense. In silence, what is false falls apart. And you feel it. You sense that there are people who can't stand your silence because it forces them to see themselves without the reflection of your energy. When you stop talking, stop explaining, and just observe, everything that was hidden comes to light. The control, the manipulation, the lack of reciprocity. But there's also something sacred in this process. Because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of consciousness. It's there in this space where there's no longer any defense, that you begin to truly listen to yourself. You begin to perceive what's good for you and what's unbalanced, what nourishes you and what consumes you. And it's curious because the more you remain silent, the more the world reveals its true face. People show who they are when they no longer need to be heard. Love shows how real it is when it no longer depends on words to exist. At first, silence is frightening. It feels like loneliness. It feels empty. But little by little, it becomes home. What was once discomfort becomes refuge, because silence isn't the absence of the other. It's a reconnection with yourself. It restores the peace you traded for noise, the strength you gave away trying to maintain bonds that no longer had life. It's the moment you realize that love doesn't need noise to be true. Mature love is serene, calm, and silent. It doesn't beg, it exists. And perhaps what surprises you most is realizing how silence changes your outlook. What once seemed enchanting now seems distant. What held you back now seems small. You realize it wasn't love that held you back. It was the fear of listening to yourself. Because deep down, you always knew. You always felt the weight of the presence that drained you. But while the noise existed, you didn't have to face it. Silence arrives as truth, and truth, even when it hurts, frees. The soul has its own rhythm, and it can only be heard when the world falls silent. That's why sometimes what you call solitude is simply the divine calling you back to your center. Silence brings you face to face with your essence, and in this encounter, everything false begins to fade. It's as if your light, hidden for so long, begins to rekindle. You begin to realize how much you gave of yourself to those who never truly wanted to know you, and how much you tried to be heard by those who never intended to listen. Silence doesn't just reveal the other person, it reveals you. It shows how much your soul needs space, how valuable your presence is, how rare your love is. And that's why it's so transformative. Because contrary to what it seems, silence doesn't distance you. It brings you closer to what's true. It shows you that there's a difference between being accompanied and being at peace, between having someone and having reciprocity. If you've ever felt the power of this silence, if you realized that it began to show you who was really by your side and who was just erasing you with their own emptiness, write in the comments, "Silence showed me the truth." There's a silent moment when something inside you changes, a moment when the soul, tired of hiding, decides to rise. It's the return to your light. After so long trying to be understood, loved, accepted, you realize that your light doesn't depend on anyone, that it never did, that what the other extinguished wasn't your essence, but merely its reflection on the wrong walls. And it's at that point that rebirth begins. Not the rebirth that comes with applause or promises, but the one born in the darkness, in the deepest silence, where only you and God know what had to die for your light to shine again. For a long time you believed that love was the fuel of your light, that you needed someone's presence to feel whole, that the absence of another was synonymous with emptiness. But now, looking at everything that remains, you begin to understand that true light comes from awareness, not companionship. Your soul, when awakened, refuses to live on reflections, and what once seemed like love now reveals itself as learning. Those who love you, see you. Those who drain you, extinguish you. These words begin to make sense when you understand that the love that illuminates is the one that allows you to be whole, and the one that extinguishes you is the one that needs to diminish you to stay lit. The return to your light doesn't happen all at once. It comes like a gentle breath, like an old memory returning. You begin to feel your own energy reorganizing, as if your spiritual body is finally breathing again. Peace, which once seemed impossible, begins to approach. The silence, which once hurt, now comforts. The emptiness, which once frightened you, now welcomes you, because emptiness isn't the absence of meaning. It's a free space for your light to once again occupy what has always been yours. There's a clarity that emerges when you stop blaming yourself for being erased, because the soul understands. Whoever erases you never loved you. They loved the reflection of what they could take from you, but not the real you. Those who love you don't fear your brilliance, aren't offended by your presence, and don't compete with your essence. True love recognizes the other's light and wants to grow with it. But love that comes from the ego must diminish you to exist. And it's this kind of bond that, when broken, restores your spiritual vision. You begin to remember what it means to be whole. You begin to remember the feeling of being with yourself without needing an audience. Your presence becomes enough. What was once loneliness becomes reunion. Your soul returns to occupy the space from which it had been absent out of fear, guilt, or attachment. And in this return you realize that nothing that was taken from you was truly yours. What was true remained, even amidst the chaos. What was illusory, what depended on the gaze of others, has faded over time, like dust carried by the wind. Rumi said there is a light that never goes out, even when the world grows dark. This light is your center. It's what remains when everything else falls away. And when you begin to return to it, the world no longer seems threatening. The pain that was once unbearable begins to transform into wisdom. The love that wounded you becomes seen as the portal that brought you here. And everything that seemed like the end was actually just the beginning of an awakening. Because every time someone tries to extinguish your light and you survive, it comes back stronger. There's something profoundly divine about this process of rekindling yourself. Because returning to your light isn't an act of vanity, it's an act of surrender. It's the moment you stop looking outside for what's always been inside. And little by little, the glow returns. Not the glow that seeks approval, but the quiet glow of someone who's self-sufficient. Your energy begins to shift. Old people move away, new ones come closer, and life seems to lead you to a place where there's more truth, more calm, more presence. You become selective, not out of pride, but out of awareness. You understand that not all presence is good, not all love is healing, that some people show up to test your faith and others to remind you of your worth. And this distinction comes with time, with silence, with the maturation of the soul. Returning to your light isn't about defeating anyone, it's about overcoming your own darkness. It's about recognizing that the light the other failed to see remains alive, intact, awaiting your return gaze. And when that gaze turns inward, everything changes. You begin to see the beauty of simplicity, the power of truth. Your presence becomes firm, your energy begins to attract what is light. What once hurt you no longer carries the same weight. What once held you back no longer reaches you. Because when the light returns, the darkness loses its power. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that you never stopped being light. You just forgot about it for a while. Spiritual rebirth doesn't happen in grand gestures, but in small awakenings. One day, you wake up and realize you no longer feel the need to prove anything, that you no longer need to explain who you are, that your peace is worth more than any presence. And in that moment, the entire universe seems to breathe with you. Because when a soul shines again, everything around it changes its tone. If you felt this return within yourself, if you realized that your light began to be reborn after being extinguished for so long, write in the comments, "I return to my light." There is a solitude that is not absence but return. A solitude that doesn't hurt, that doesn't suffocate, that doesn't isolate you from the world. It simply returns you to yourself. It is the moment when the soul, tired of noise and the wrong presence, begins to seek refuge within. And strange as it may seem, this isolation is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of everything. Rumi said that the wound is the place where the light enters. And it is in this space of retreat that your wound begins to breathe, that the divine touches you again, that your spirit detoxifies from the energies that kept it trapped in something that no longer vibrated at your frequency. It's not loneliness, it's detoxing from the wrong presence. The difference is subtle but profound. When you walk away from someone who drained your light, your body experiences withdrawal, like someone quitting an addiction. There's emptiness, there's silence, there's a discomfort that feels like loneliness, but it's actually the soul rebalancing itself, returning to its proper rhythm. The mind tries to deceive you, telling you that you've lost something important, that you need to go back, that you can't go on. But the soul, wise and patient, simply observes. It knows that this emptiness is healing, that silence is the medicine. Walking away at this point in the journey is not an act of coldness. It is an act of faith. Faith that your heart still knows the way. Faith that there is something greater watching over your reconstruction. Faith that the love that comes from God does not extinguish you but illuminates you, and that sometimes the divine needs to leave you alone to remind you where your light comes from. Because while your world revolved around someone else, you forgot to revolve within yourself. And it is in this sacred isolation that the axis returns to its place. Rumi said, "When you are alone, you are in good company." And that's exactly it. Solitude, when it comes from consciousness, is a temple. It's the space where the ego falls silent and the soul finally speaks. It's there that you realize how far you've distanced yourself trying to maintain what was no longer reciprocal. How much you've given up your peace in exchange for small doses of affection. How much you've tried to sustain a love that, in truth, sustained your fear. And for the first time, silence doesn't hurt. It cleanses. There's a peace that only comes when the noise fades. A clarity that only emerges when the heart calms. And it's in this space of solitude that you begin to realize how intoxicated your energy has been. The wrong kind of relationship is like a slow poison. It doesn't kill you immediately, but it weakens you until you forget what it felt like to be light. When you step away, your spiritual body begins to react. Your soul breathes, and what was once pain begins to transform into presence. It's not easy to accept this phase. The ego wants to rush, wants to fill the void, wants to find another presence to numb the absence. But the soul knows that haste is the enemy of healing. It asks you for stillness. It asks you for time. It asks you for surrender. Because what's happening within you is sacred. It's the process of purification, the detoxification of the voices that confused you, the looks that diminished you, the promises that kept you trapped. Each day of conscious solitude is a step back to your essence. And little by little, something begins to change. What once seemed like loss now feels like liberation. What once was fear now feels like trust. You realize that silence isn't an absence of love. It's the purest form of connection with the divine. That the emptiness that frightens you is actually space for the new. That the solitude that heals is the reconnection with God within you. True spirituality begins at this point, when you understand that your communion with the sacred doesn't depend on temples or external presences, but on your state of consciousness. And in this retreat, you once again feel part of something greater. Nature touches you again, the little things take on meaning again. The sound of the wind, the smell of the morning, the soft light streaming through the window. Everything seems to speak to you. It's the universe reminding you that you were never alone, just surrounded by the wrong voices. That God's presence has always been there, waiting for your silence to make room for Him to enter. Solitude then transforms into companionship. You listen to yourself, understand yourself, forgive yourself. You begin to respect your own rhythms, begin to manage your energy more consciously, learn to say no without guilt, to walk away without fear, to choose peace over presence. Because the soul, when awakened, recognizes what strengthens it and what sickens it. And moving away at this level ceases to be pain and becomes prayer. Every step away from what drains you is a step toward the divine that inhabits you. This is the healing power of solitude. It cleanses you, renews you, reconnects you. And however much the ego tries to label it as isolation, the soul knows it is expansion. Because when you choose silence and retreat, you are not escaping the world, you are returning home. You are encountering the most real presence there is, your own. If these words touched something in you, if at any point in your journey you felt like you needed to step away to breathe again, write in the comments. I healed myself in silence. When silence becomes light again, it's a sign that you've returned to yourself. There's a moment when the soul, after so much noise, begins to breathe again. An almost imperceptible instant when the weight dissolves and your presence fits within your own body. It's the beginning of peace after the toxic presence, the return to your natural state of being. Because peace isn't something you achieve externally, it's something you recover within, after having shed everything that weighed you down. And this lightness doesn't come overnight. It arises slowly, like a breeze after a storm, like a whisper after so much shouting. For a long time, living with the wrong presence made you believe peace was impossible. You grew accustomed to chaos, constant tension, the need to explain yourself. It was like living in an energy field where every gesture was watched, where every emotion needed to be controlled. And now, in the silence, you realize how exhausted you were, how much you carried the weight of a coexistence that drained your soul, made you feel smaller, made you doubt your own light. But the absence of this presence, as painful as it may have been at first, begins to reveal something you haven't felt in a long time: tranquility. The inner space expands. The air feels lighter. Your mind begins to quiet. Rumi said, "Light enters where the absence of the false makes space." And that's exactly it. Peace comes when the false disappears. When what was disguise falls away. When what was attachment dissolves. When what was fear ceases to rule. You begin to realize that it wasn't love you lacked. It was silence. That it wasn't loneliness that frightened you. It was the excess of emotional noise. The toxic presence disguised itself as need, but in truth it was just noise occupying the space where the divine should dwell. There's a huge difference between being accompanied and being at peace. Accompaniment is physical presence. Peace is spiritual attunement. And while your soul was enveloped in dense energy, you couldn't feel this difference. You thought having someone nearby was the same as having a connection, when in fact, it was the opposite. Your essence was always on alert, trying to defend itself, trying not to disappear. Now, freed from this burden, you begin to recognize the value of simplicity, the value of stillness, the value of breathing without fear. Peace after a toxic presence is almost a rebirth. It doesn't come with euphoria, but with serenity. It's a calm that's frightening at first, because your body is still accustomed to chaos. It's as if your soul needs to relearn how to rest, relearn how to trust, relearn how to exist without tension. And it's in this relearning that you realize that love was never what hurt you. It was the imbalance. Love, when it's real, doesn't drain. It soothes, it heals, it liberates. It's curious to see how silence begins to change its texture. What once seemed empty now becomes sacred space. What was once pain is now rest. Silence ceases to be an echo of absence and transforms into a melody of presence. You begin to listen to yourself, and the sound of your own breathing becomes enough. This is true healing. When your inner world regains sound, color, and movement. When the simple act of being with yourself ceases to be discomfort and becomes a refuge. This phase brings a spiritual lucidity that only those who have experienced the wrong experience can understand. Because toxic relationships don't just destroy love, they destroy perception. You become so accustomed to instability that balance seems strange. You distrust peace, doubt calm, but little by little your soul begins to re-educate you. It shows you that silence isn't emptiness, it's purity. That separation isn't loss, it's protection. That time alone isn't punishment, it's reconstruction. When peace begins to return, it doesn't require announcement, it doesn't need witnesses. It simply settles in. You wake up and realize you slept well. You walk and feel the air change. You look back and no longer feel anger, only gratitude. This is proof that the soul has returned to its proper place. The energy changes, the outlook changes, the way you relate changes. What once affected you now no longer reaches you, because your vibration has risen. The toxic presence teaches you about the absence of God, and the silence that follows teaches you about returning to Him. It is in this clean, uninterrupted space that you begin to feel the divine again, not as a distant figure, but as a constant vibration within you. The peace that comes after chaos is a sign that love has returned to its pure form. It is the rebalancing of your energy, the return of your soul to its center. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that this peace doesn't depend on anything external. It's not a reward, it's a state. It exists within you, waiting for the moment when the false leaves the scene so it can manifest. And when it returns, you understand the purpose of it all. You understand why the separation was necessary, why silence was important, why emptiness was part of the healing. Because nothing thrives in toxic soil. It took cleansing, it took emptying, it took losing. So now finally you can breathe. If this part of the video reminded you of the lightness that came after a heavy cycle, if you recognize the taste of that silent peace that comes after pain, write in the comments, "I found peace after chaos." Not all love is a path. Some are trials, silent, subtle trials that the divine places before you, not to punish you, but to awaken you. And it is at this point that everything changes. When its presence extinguishes you, it is God calling you back to your own light. It is life telling you that it is time to escape the emotional labyrinth where you have lost yourself, trying to understand what was never love. There is something deeply spiritual about this kind of pain, because it comes not only to break your heart, it comes to open your eyes. And when you finally see, suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes initiation. Rumi said that human love is the mirror in which divine love is reflected, but the mirror sometimes breaks, and it's when the reflection distorts that you learn to see beyond the surface. You discover that not every relationship is destiny. Some are portals that lead you back to what is true. Every tear, every silence, every absence, every goodbye is a call from the divine, saying, "Come back. Your light is there within, waiting for you." And even when everything seems to fall apart, there is a hidden wisdom guiding you back to your essence, reminding you that what the other tried to erase never ceased to exist. This awareness comes slowly, almost like a dawn. At first you still feel the weight, still think, still search for answers. But over time your heart begins to understand that what faded outside was merely a reflection of what needed to be reborn within. True love, the one that is the home of the soul, is not built on dependence but on presence. And perhaps that's why God, in His silent mercy, allows certain people to pass through your life, not to stay, but to light the fire of remembrance. The remembrance of who you are without anyone's gaze. You begin to realize that there's a greater force in everything that's happened to you. That every time someone made you feel small, the universe was teaching you about greatness. That every time someone erased you, the divine was training you to recognize your brilliance without needing witnesses. There's a subtle purpose in the experiences that hurt the most. They don't come to destroy, they come to purify. Suffering, when understood consciously, becomes a portal of transmutation. And it's at this point that the spiritual and the human meet, in the ability to transform pain into awakening. The soul understands that certain presences were not sent to complete you, but to free you. They come to break the invisible bonds that kept you trapped in old forms of love, in old ways of seeing yourself. And when pain does its work, you reconnect with what is essential. Loneliness ceases to be absence and becomes communion with something greater. Silence ceases to be emptiness and becomes a temple. Life, which once seemed like noise, begins to sound like music again. Rumi said that the wound is the place where the light enters. And now you understand. Because everything that hurt you opened the way for the divine to touch you again. Every time the wrong presence made you doubt yourself, God was showing you where your faith still didn't reach. And when you finally let go of what no longer belongs to you, a profound calm sets in. It's the peace that comes after learning. It's not euphoria. It's not victory. It's simply serenity. The kind of serenity that arises when the soul finally understands that there are no losses. There are liberations in disguise. You begin to see beauty in what once seemed unfair. You begin to understand that the love denied you wasn't rejection, it was redirection. That the other person's silence wasn't indifference, it was protection. That distance wasn't abandonment, it was preparation. Because the divine works in silence, and its movements are rarely immediately understood. Everything that seemed like chaos was actually the invisible thread leading you back to your own light. And now, when you look back, what once hurt becomes prayer. Every memory carries wisdom. Every goodbye carries gratitude. You understand that true love doesn't need to endure to be sacred. It fulfills the role of transforming you, of bringing you closer to God, of shaping you until your light shines on its own. Human love passes, but divine love endures. It is what remains when everything else fades. It is the spark that keeps you going even after being extinguished 1,000 times. This is the vibration of rebirth, a state where there is no longer any need to struggle, only to be. The soul, finally at peace, rests within its own body, and the silence that was once pain is now sacred. Everything that others took from you, the divine presence returns in double measure. Peace, lucidity, faith, love. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that there is no need to understand anything. Just feel, because there are things that only the heart understands when the mind is silent. If you felt that this message spoke to your soul, if you recognized this silent call to return to your own light, write in the comments, "God called me back to myself." If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognized the truth of this video. And if you felt that connection, if something inside you awakened during this journey, leave your like, so that this message can reach other souls who also need to remember who they are. Subscribe to the channel if you feel that your soul is on a journey, if you understand that each word here is a mirror of your own transformation, because this space is about that, about souls who have awakened from the slumber of the ego and are returning home, one consciousness at a time. And now, watch the next video that is now appearing on the screen, because it is the natural continuation of this healing. In it, I will show you how silence gives you back the power that the wrong love took away, the power to be whole, even when the world wants you in pieces. This is your time to return to your light, because when you choose your peace, the entire universe reorganizes itself to accompany you.